Serious, nurses and doctors of Reddit, what's your weirdest, scariest paranormal stories that took place during work? Did a rotation in a burn unit. There are tons of stories that go around, but I'll share my favorite. A pimp lit one of his prostitutes on fire, and she immediately bear hugged him, causing them to both suffer pretty severe injuries. Unfortunately, hers included an inhalation burn. They both were being treated in the same ICU but on opposite ends. Weeks later she ends up coding and passes away, and after about 30 minutes, as things start to quiet down, the guy starts screaming from his room, "Get her out! Get the goddamn bitch out of my room!" There is probably some medical explanation for this, but still the weirdest thing I've seen as a nurse so far. We had a very robust, confused old lady on our floor. Her room was in front of the nurse's station so we could keep an eye on her, and had one of our nurse's aides as a sitter too. She was always fighting, kicking, trying to get out of bed, very restless and agitated, as some patients I've had before can get before death. One day we were called into the room as her heart rate was going down and she lay still with her eyes open. It was 30, 20, then flatlined. We checked for a pulse and did not find any. She was a DNR, so we did not attempt resuscitation. We close her eyes, prepare to get the body bag and call the family. The sitter remains in there to start getting the body ready. Less than 10 minutes later she calls us back in. The old lady is at it again, hitting, kicking, trying to get out of the bed. She came back to life. Honestly, we found the situation hilarious, and I still have never seen any patient come back like that on their own. I think she made it out of the hospital too. I've worked in a small family-run nursing home for 6 years as a nurse aide. It was an orphanage before it became a nursing home, and unfortunately before being shut down the orphanage had a history of severe abuse and neglect. Unfortunately, it's not gossip, the owner herself has told us. When residents get close to death they always see a little girl. One of my patients, a very alert 102-year-old gentleman, he knew all our names and was very alert and oriented. I was passing dinner trays and saw that he had his back turned and was talking and laughing in the corner. I knocked and asked him who he was talking to, and he chucked and said, "This little girl came into my room. She was scared." He died 3 days later. About 6 months later, had a subacute patient screaming about a little girl grabbing his feet and she needed to leave him alone. He died that night. She's come up over the years, it's always the same thing, they see her and then they die. Other co-workers have had the same experience. It's very unsettling. Edit. Sorry for grammar errors. Something I've always struggled with and am working on it. I worked in a pediatric hospital and had always heard that the 4th floor right outside our oncology unit was haunted. I worked 3/12s normally but would pick up overtime and picked up a night shift. I was working in the NICU, which happened to also be on the 4th floor but on the opposite side. The oncology unit had a staircase that was a shortcut down to the cafeteria, which was on the 2nd floor. At about 3 a.m. I was ready to take a short break and wanted a cup of coffee from the cafeteria, so I decided to take that staircase. I walked through the automatic double doors and saw a kid skipping down the hall. I called out to him as I was afraid a little kid had snuck out of a patient room. As soon as I called out to him, he turned and in the blink of an eye totally vanished. A lot of other nurses and docs had seen the same little kid skipping in that same hallway. Of course, I chalked it up to just exhaustion and didn't really think about it much after that. But you were damn sure I didn't use that hallway at night ever again. I was working at night and one of the patients died while I was in the room. We tried everything to revive this person but it didn't work, so after doing the papers and everything I went to another place in the hospital, and I swear to God that this patient who I saw dead touched my right arm. I think that I have never cried that much in my life. I used to work in a nursing home as both a CNA and an LPN, and while nothing too crazy happened, there were definitely things that happened out of the ordinary. I remember one time after someone had died, I was cleaning up her body and the door to the room swung wide open even though it had been firmly latched. Nobody was there. It gave me the creeps. There were instances of furniture being moved, lights turning on and off by themselves, and toilets randomly flushing by themselves as well. I also remember I had one resident one night who asked me to make sure I closed the door to the closet that was at the end of her bed, and she told me that when it was open that woman kept going in and out of it all night and it kept her awake. When I worked at the funeral home, I was told a story about an elderly lady that had died. The husband said he wanted her to be buried with her ring as she never took it off. My co-worker was in the morgue and was washing the body. She removed the ring to mark it down on the paperwork. As soon as she did, a styrofoam head they used for wigs went flying across the room. She just said out loud, all right, I'll put your ring back on. No more disturbances." I have a story kinda like this. Not funeral related, but I was at my grandpa's house I think 3 years after my grandma died. Whole family was there like we do every night, talking, having a good time. My uncle said something about the decor, which my grandma picked out. I think he said something about it being ugly or something. All of a sudden a glass lamp falls and breaks. One of the rooms we have is obviously having something of a haunting. A man in a gown gestured one of the techs to come in. She went in and he was gone. 1 week earlier a female PT was asking to get a different room, because a man wouldn't leave her room. We just thought it was some sort of delirium. Multiple others have seen him too. A ward I worked on once had a patient who was a psychic medium as a patient. We had a bit of a laugh with her as she was on the ward for a while. She'd had a stroke which affected her mobility, and she would do readings for the staff etc. from time to time. I took it all as just a bit of fun until one evening when she pressed her nurse call buzzer and told us to go check on a patient in a side room as he was dead. We went to check and sure enough found that the gentleman had died. Later on we asked our psychic patient how she had known, and she told us she had seen him coming out of his room obviously distressed. She realized he had died and had to explain to him what had happened and help him to pass over, go to the light. Now I am not a believer, but that gave me the creeps. Worked in a nursing home long-term facility for multiple years. Personally hadn't experienced anything too crazy apart from mystery call lights, call bell system going off. No buttons lit up, no rooms lit up. System would have to be reset from the electrical room to clear it. Hearing doors close shut. Toilets flushing, faucets running. These were by no means commonplace. Other staff had some more direct experiences though. Apparently in one hall a little girl would occasionally be seen walking. This had been reported by multiple staff as well as patients. A staff member was sitting out in her car during night shift when some woman who knocked on her window and quickly disappeared. The next day she was discussing this out loud with the oncoming shift when someone pulled out a picture from old files based on the description provided. Apparently, it was a match to a former patient that had passed away at least 10 years before that staff member was hired. My mom worked at a hospital in our town that shut down around 15 years ago. They were having a sort of farewell party with all the staff. She, my sister and I took a walk around at the end to take a last look. We went to the 4th floor and were the only people up there. Small hospital, easy to tell. As we're walking down the hallway, we hear footsteps that sounded like men's dress shoes walking next to us, louder and different than all our sneakers. When we stopped, the footsteps kept going down the hall. Once they got down the hall, the emergency light and alarm over the room started sounding. My mom went over and couldn't turn it off because the system was disconnected, turned off. I think she tried really hard to keep it together for us because all she said was that's weird, this whole system is already off. But I do remember us noping to the elevator right after that. When we got in the elevator, the button for the ground floor was pushed already. Easy to explain away as some other kid pushing all the buttons, but still weird given the circumstances. Back when I was a paramedic in Oakland, I was taking care of an elderly gentleman in the back of my ambulance. He looked up into the upper corner of the ambulance and said, "It's okay, Lulu, I'll be with you soon." His daughter was with him and told me that Lulu was his wife who died 20 years earlier. A few minutes later he went into cardiac arrest and passed on. I'm a psychiatric nurse. Early in my career, I worked at a residential mental health facility. There was a resident I'll call Marion Dutchine. He was an elective mute, which simply means that he couldn't talk, but there were no pathological findings as to why. He had spoken earlier in his life and in fact seemed quite normal back then, with the notable exception of being close to 7 feet tall. He'd been raised in the Deep South and joined the military when he was 19. After boot camp, he was stationed somewhere in the South. One night, he just vanished. It was declared in a wall for years, and finally he was declared missing and dead. 10 years later, a 7-foot-tall man walked into a VA hospital emergency room in my part of the Midwest and said to the receptionist, "My name is Marion Dutchine and I've been dead for 10 years. Those were the last words he ever spoke. He was covered with dust and he was wearing the same clothes he'd been reported to be wearing the night he vanished. His social security number had not been used and he had no identification on his person. However, they were able to identify him, I guess via fingerprints. He was well fed and in good health, except for his refusal to speak. The family was notified, but they said they had already grieved their lost man and that whomever was claiming to be him simply could not be. They said he was a haint and a stand-in for their dead relative and demanded not to be contacted again. Marion paced all day every day, not in a frantic way, but just lumbering up and down the halls and outside. He smiled all the time and would be moving his mouth in a way that indicated talking or muttering, but he was dead silent. He had an unnerving habit of throwing his head back with his mouth wide open as if he were laughing heartily, but not even a breath could be heard. If told to go to the dining room for a meal, he'd go and eat, but if nobody told him, he just kept pacing, never indicating hunger. If offered a cigarette, he'd smoke it in an oddly formal way, almost delicately, if that makes sense. But he never seemed to crave smoking. The man wanted nothing. If I talked to him, he appeared to listen, periodically throwing his head back in that laughter-mimicking way of his. There was nothing to do for this man. Various medications were tried, but they did not affect him either positively or negatively. Occupational therapy did nothing because Marion would just grin, and unless told to stay put, he'd get up and start pacing again. On my last day at that job, on my way to something better, the last thing I saw was Marion, pacing in the parking lot, throwing his head back to laugh. Later I wondered if all along I'd been dealing with a ghost. All these years later, I still don't know. I'm an ICU nurse. A patient's son rang the hospital at 11 p.m. on a Saturday night saying he was sure his dad was dying. His dad had had a severe stroke and was doing okay. Recovery would be difficult, but he wasn't expected to die and was pretty stable at the time. I was looking after him and it was a lot of work because he would try to get up but couldn't walk, so he'd fallen a lot. The son really wanted to come in, even though it's way past visiting hours, but you know I'll bend the rules in a good cause. I figured, what the heck, it's his Saturday night. Come on in and sit with your dad. Patient died about 2 minutes before the son walked in the door. It was like a switch was turned off. He just died. The last thing he said to me was, "Am I bothering anyone?" I told him of course not. Even though he had some very frustrating behavior because of the stroke, the son just started crying and screaming. I knew it. How the heck he knew? We were all a bit freaked out.
Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification button. See you next time.